The thin rubber soles of her sneakers slapped against the wet asphalt, a frantic percussive beat against the drumming of the rain. Each gasp for air was a painful tear in her throat, a ragged sound swallowed by the storm. Lena didn't dare look back. She knew what was there, not a monster with claws and teeth, but something far more terrifying. A handsome face twisted into a mask of cold ownership, the glint of car headlights cutting through the downpour, hunting her. The streetlights were hazy, jaundiced blurs, offering no comfort, only illuminating the silver sheets of rain that felt like a cage. Her lungs burned, her legs were leaden. Panic was a physical entity, a cold hand clamped around her heart, squeezing with relentless pressure. Then she saw it. Not a sanctuary, not a haven, just a place. A diner, squat and unassuming, its large plate glass windows glowing with a warm, buttery light that seemed impossible in the churning darkness. The neon sign above it, spelling out Oaken Branch Diner in buzzing red letters, was a beacon. It was a place with people. A place that wasn't the suffocating silence of the apartment she had just fled. It was a choice, the only one she had left. With the last dregs of her strength, she veered off the sidewalk, her body a projectile of pure desperation, and threw herself at the glass door. The small bell tethered to the doorframe let out a cheerful, incongruous jingle. For a moment, all sound in the diner ceased. The low hum of conversation, the clatter of cutlery, the sizzle from the grill, it all vanished, sucked into the vacuum created by her entrance. She stood there, dripping, gasping, her chest heaving. The warmth of the diner washed over her, a shocking contrast to the icy rain clinging to her skin and hair. The air smelled of coffee, frying bacon, and something else. Something clean and safe. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Families in booths, a trucker at the counter, a young couple sharing a milkshake. And in the back, in the largest booth, a group of men whose presence seemed to absorb the light around them. Lena's gaze darted around, frantic. She saw a waitress, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a tired but steady expression, holding a coffee pot mid-air. Lena opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to plead for a help she didn't know how to ask for, but only a choked sob escaped. Her body trembled violently, an engine of fear that had run out of road. She took a staggering step toward the counter, her hand outstretched as if reaching for a lifeline. Then the bell jingled again. The sound was no longer cheerful. It was a death knell. The warmth in the room curdled. Richard stood in the doorway, the rain slicking his dark hair back from his forehead. He was smiling. It was the smile he used when he was closing a business deal, the one that made people trust him, the one that made her stomach clench with a familiar, sickening dread. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were flat chips of ice scanning the room, assessing, calculating. They landed on her, and the smile widened, a predator locating its cornered prey. "There you are, honey," he said, his voice a smooth, reasonable balm that was meant to soothe the onlookers, to frame this as a simple lover's quarrel. "You had me worried running out into a storm like that. Let's go home." He took a step inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The cozy diner suddenly felt like a locked room, the air thick and unbreathable. Lena felt a wave of dizziness. The faces of the other patrons blurred. There was nowhere else to run. The road had ended here, in a pool of fluorescent light on a worn linoleum floor, surrounded by strangers who were already turning away, eager to return to their meals, to the safety of not being involved. Her hope, so bright and desperate only a moment ago, guttered like a candle in a gale. He had found her. Of course, he had found her. He always did. He owned her world, and she had made the foolish mistake of trying to leave it. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, waiting for the inevitable snap. Lena's life hadn't always been a cage. She could remember a time, albeit faintly, of scraped knees and the smell of her mother's perfume, a soft floral scent that clung to worn sweaters. Her mother was a ghost of a memory, a collection of faded photographs and a single cherished object, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside, a microscopic photo of a smiling woman holding a baby. After her mother's death, when Lena was 7, the world had become a series of temporary homes, the faces of foster parents blurring into one another. She had learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. At 18, the system had released her with a thin folder of paperwork and a final sterile handshake. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She met Richard 6 months later. She was working as a barista, struggling to pay rent on a tiny room, eating instant noodles more nights than not. He came in every morning, always impeccably dressed, always with a charming smile and a generous tip. He called her by her name. He asked about her day. He seemed to see her, the invisible girl, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with a radiator. He was a successful contractor, older, established. He talked about his projects, building homes for families, and he exuded an aura of stability that was as intoxicating to her as any drug. Their first dates were a whirlwind of generosity. He took her to restaurants where she was afraid to touch the silverware. He bought her new clothes, replacing her worn-out jeans and threadbare sweaters with things she never would have chosen for herself, things he said better suited her. He told her she didn't have to work anymore, that he wanted to take care of her. It sounded like a fairy tale. It felt like being rescued. She moved into his pristine modern house, a place of polished concrete floors and vast windows that overlooked the city. She thought she had finally found a home. The shift was gradual, a slow, insidious tightening of a net she didn't realize was closing around her. It began with small things. "I don't like that friend of yours," he'd say, about the one person she still texted from her old life. "She's a bad influence." Soon, Lena found it was just easier not to reply. Then it was her phone. He'd pick it up casually, scrolling through her messages, her call history. "Just making sure you're safe," he'd say, with that disarming smile. He took over her finances, setting up a joint account to which she had no direct access. He gave her a weekly allowance, just enough for groceries, telling her it was to help her learn to budget. She, who had been budgeting every penny since she was a teenager, felt a prickle of shame and said nothing. The charm began to flicker, revealing the cold machinery beneath. An overcooked steak would result in a tirade about her incompetence. Coming home 10 minutes late from the grocery store would trigger a cold, silent fury that was worse than yelling. He never hit her, not at first. His weapons were words, silence, and a suffocating sense of control. He isolated her so completely that her world shrank to the 4 walls of his house. He was the sun she orbited, and he was a cold, distant star. The locket was her last connection to the girl she had been. She never took it off. It was a small, cool weight against her skin, a tangible piece of a past that was hers alone. One evening, during an argument over a bill she had forgotten to pay from her meager allowance, his anger had taken on a new, terrifying edge. His face had gone dark, his voice a low growl. "You are so ungrateful," he'd seethed. "After everything I've done for you." His eyes had fixed on the locket. Before she could react, he had reached out, his fingers cold and strong, and unclasped it from her neck. He held it in his palm, a tiny silver gleam against his skin. "Maybe this will help you remember what's important," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "Me." He slipped it into his pocket. The loss was a physical blow. It was as if he had reached into her chest and torn out the last piece of her that he didn't own. That night she lay awake, the space on her neck feeling cold and bare. She heard his words from earlier echo in her mind, a threat he had delivered with a casual air as if discussing the weather. "You know, Lena, if you ever even thought about leaving me, I'd make it my mission to ruin you. I'd make sure you had nothing. No one would ever believe you over me." That was the moment the net became a cage, and she knew she had to escape, not just for her freedom, but for her life. The next afternoon, while he was at a client meeting, she had grabbed nothing but her purse and run, the memory of his hand closing around her locket, propelling her out the door and into the cleansing, terrifying rain. Before the bell on the diner door had announced a crisis, the men in the back booth were a study in disciplined stillness. They were the silent wardens, a motorcycle club whose reputation was a quiet one, whispered on the long, lonely highways of the country. Their vests were made of thick, worn black leather, softened by thousands of miles of sun and rain. The patch on their backs was not a skull or a demon, but a stylized, stoic owl with wide, seeing eyes, stitched in muted silver thread. Below it, in simple block letters, were the words, "Nos vide," we see. They had been riding for 3 days, a cross-country run, to attend the funeral of a fallen brother in another state. This diner was an unplanned stop, a place to escape the sudden squall and get a hot meal. Their movements were economical, their presence solid. They had taken the largest booth, the one in the back corner, instinctively positioning themselves with a clear view of the entrance and the rest of the room. It was a habit forged from a collective lifetime of vigilance. The man at the head of the table, the one they called Bear, was their president. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick, gray-streaked beard and hands that could likely crush stone, but were currently wrapped gently around a steaming mug of black coffee. His eyes, a surprisingly pale blue, missed nothing. He had a profound stillness about him, the calm of a man who had faced down chaos and found it wanting. He had been a logger in the Pacific Northwest before a catastrophic accident had taught him about the fragility of the body and the strength of brotherhood. To his right sat Doc. He was leaner, with wire-rimmed glasses he was meticulously cleaning with a small cloth. His real name was Samuel, and he had served 2 tours as an Army combat medic. His hands, now resting on the table, were preternaturally steady. He had set bones in the desert dust and stitched wounds by the light of a chemical stick. He saw the world in terms of triage. What was broken and how could it be fixed? He had noted the girl's trembling, her pallor, and the way her eyes were blown wide, with more than just exertion the moment she stumbled through the door. Across from him was Scribe. Younger than the others, with an academic air about him, he was methodically making entries in a small, leather-bound notebook. His name was Elias, and he had been a paralegal once, a man who believed in the power of order and verifiable facts. He managed the club's logistics, their finances, their routes. To him, the world was a collection of details, and he knew that salvation, or damnation, was often found in the smallest of them. He had already noted the make and model of the car that had fishtailed to a stop outside just before the girl ran in. A late-model black sedan, expensive, out of place. The other members, a dozen strong, mirrored their leader's composure. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in low tones, a shared language of nods and grunts that conveyed more than a torrent of words ever could. Their code was simple and unspoken. You ride for the man next to you. You are accountable for your actions. You do not start trouble. And most sacred of all, you stand as a wall for those who cannot stand for themselves. They were not vigilantes, they were observers, guardians. They believed that the greatest strength was not in the noise you made, but in the attention you paid. When Lena had burst in, a wave of collective silent assessment had passed through their booth. They saw the wet clothes and the heaving chest, but they also saw the primal hunted fear that clung to her like a second skin. They saw trouble coming, and they did not look away. Richard's voice, dripping with feigned concern, sliced through the diner's tense atmosphere. "Honey, what are you doing? You're scaring me, running out like that." He moved toward Lena, his steps confident, proprietary. He was playing a role for the audience. The worried boyfriend, patient and kind in the face of a woman's irrationality. His hand reached for her arm, a gesture meant to look reassuring, supportive. Lena flinched. It was not a small, shy movement. It was a violent, full-body recoil, as if his touch were a lit flame. Her arm jerked back, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was breathtaking. In the back booth, that single spastic motion sent a silent signal through the wardens. Bear's eyes narrowed slightly. Doc stopped cleaning his glasses. Scribe's pen paused over his notebook. This was not a lover's spat. This was the reflexive terror of an animal that knows the feel of the trap. The waitress, Carol, who had seen 60 years of life from behind this counter, recognized it too. She moved with surprising speed, placing her body squarely between Richard and Lena. The coffee pot was still in her hand, a makeshift, sloshing weapon. "Sir," she said, her voice firm, "I think you should give the young lady a minute to catch her breath." For a single, unguarded second, Richard's mask of civility disintegrated. A flash of incandescent rage, cold and reptilian, blazed in his eyes. His mouth tightened into a bloodless line. He looked at this middle-aged woman as if she were an insect to be crushed. The transformation was so swift, so complete, that anyone watching closely would have felt a chill. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. He gave a short, indulgent laugh. "Of course, she's just a little overwhelmed." He made a move to step around Carol, dismissing her as a minor obstacle. It was then that Lena spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound so thin it almost didn't exist, yet it carried across the silent room with the force of a shout. "The locket," she breathed, her eyes locked on his face. "He took the locket." The words hung in the air, oddly specific and deeply personal. It wasn't a generic cry of "leave me alone" or "he's hurting me." It was a detail, a piece of a story, a grievance that spoke not of a fleeting argument, but of a calculated act of cruelty. It was a key, turning a lock in the understanding of the room. In the back booth, Bear heard it. The phrase cut through the ambient tension like a razor. He had heard variations of that story before in different towns from different women. The taking of a sentimental object, a photograph, a piece of jewelry. It was never about the thing itself. It was an act of psychological warfare, a way to steal a person's history, to sever their anchor to who they were before the abuser came along. It was the mark of a sophisticated monster, with a low scrape of wood on linoleum that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent diner. Bear stood up. He didn't lurch to his feet or explode with aggression. He simply rose, a slow, deliberate unfolding of his massive frame. One by one, in a fluid, synchronized movement, the other 11 wardens rose with him. They didn't look at Richard. They didn't make a sound. They just stood, a silent, impassable forest of black leather and unwavering resolve. The trigger had been pulled. The time for observation was over. Bear didn't stride toward Richard. His movement was a slow, deliberate drift, like a tide coming in. He didn't invade Richard's space, but instead moved to a position slightly in front of and to the side of Lena, creating a shield with nothing more than his formidable presence. His shadow fell over her, a cloak of safety. The other wardens fanned out slightly, not in a threatening circle, but in a way that subtly altered the geometry of the room, cutting Richard off from his target and from the door. The air grew thick with unspoken intent. "The lady seems to want some space," Bear said. His voice was a low-frequency rumble, the sound of gravel turning over at the bottom of a deep river. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple, immovable statement of fact. Richard, accustomed to being the most powerful man in any room, bristled. His composure, already strained, began to fray at the edges. He drew himself up to his full height, attempting to project an authority that suddenly felt hollow. "This is a private family matter," he snapped, his voice tight. "She's my girlfriend. Frankly, she's not well. She has these episodes." He was painting his masterpiece of manipulation for the onlookers. He, the long-suffering partner; she, the hysterical, unstable woman. Scribe took a single step forward, coming to stand beside Bear. He held his small notebook in one hand, his pen in the other, as if he were about to take minutes at a board meeting. "She said something about a locket," Scribe stated, his tone neutral, inquisitive. The question hung in the air, refusing to be dismissed. Richard scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "A piece of junk. Costume jewelry. We had a silly argument and she's overreacting as usual." He waved a hand, trying to brush the entire incident away as insignificant female drama. Bear did not look at Richard. His pale blue eyes rested on Lena, offering a calm, steady point of focus in her storm of fear. "Is that right, miss?" he asked, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. For the first time that night, Lena felt a solid piece of ground beneath her feet. The presence of these silent, imposing men was an anchor. She drew a shaky breath, and looking past Richard directly at Bear, she shook her head. Her voice, when it came, was stronger, imbued with a sliver of newfound courage. "No," she said clearly, "it was my mother's. It's the only thing I have left of her." The simple, devastating truth of that statement landed like a physical blow in the diner. It vaporized Richard's narrative of a silly argument and recast his actions in the stark, cruel light of what they truly were. It was an act of profound emotional violence. Carol, the waitress, gasped softly. The trucker at the counter slowly put down his fork. Richard's mask didn't just crack, it began to shatter. "You are making a scene, Lena," he hissed, his voice dropping into a venomous whisper. He used her name like a weapon, a final attempt to reassert his dominion over her. "Let's go home, now." Bear did not move an inch. He was a granite boulder, ancient and unmovable. "I think she'll stay," he rumbled. "Have some coffee, warm up." It was phrased as a suggestion, but it was delivered as an edict. Richard's eyes darted around the room. He saw the wall of men, their faces impassive, their posture unwavering. He saw the other patrons, their gazes no longer averted, but fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and dawning contempt. He saw Carol, her hand now resting on the receiver of the diner's wall-mounted telephone. He had lost control of the narrative, the environment, the outcome. He was exposed. With a final, withering glare at Lena, a silent promise of future retribution, he spun on his heel. "Fine," he spat. "When you're done with your little tantrum, you know where to find me." The bell gave a mocking jingle as the door slammed shut behind him, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. The moment the door closed, the suffocating tension in the diner broke, replaced by a wave of collective exhale. Carol rushed forward, not with the coffee pot, but with a thick, dry towel from the kitchen. She wrapped it around Lena's trembling shoulders. "Here, honey, let's get you warm." She guided Lena to a small stool at the counter and pressed a heavy ceramic mug of steaming sweet tea into her hands. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers, a small but potent comfort. Bear gestured with his chin toward the now empty space in their booth. "Sit with us," he said. It was an invitation, but also a promise. "You're safe here." Hesitantly, Lena slid into the booth, the worn vinyl cool against her wet clothes. She found herself surrounded by the scent of leather, road dust, and coffee. It should have been intimidating, but instead, it felt like a fortress. Doc sat down across from her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He observed. His medic's eyes took in the tremor in her hands, the bluish tint of her lips. "Did he hurt you before you ran?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. Lena instinctively tried to pull the sleeve of her sweater over her wrist, but he had already seen it. A faint, purplish mark in the distinct shape of fingers. He said nothing, simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Scribe opened his notebook to a fresh page. "We might need to talk to the police," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, not alarming. "It helps if we have the details straight." He didn't push, just waited. Lena, clutching the warm mug, began to talk. The story, so long locked away in the prison of her fear, started to spill out. She spoke of the isolation, the financial control, the way he chipped away at her confidence until she felt she was nothing. She described the locket in perfect detail. The tiny clasp, the scrolling floral pattern on the front, the microscopic photo within, and then she repeated the threat, the one that had echoed in her head for weeks. "He said if I ever left, he'd make sure no one ever found me." Scribe's pen moved swiftly across the page, his writing small and neat. He captured every word. The wail of a siren grew louder, and soon the flashing red and blue lights painted the diner's windows. 2 officers came in, followed by a man in a rumpled trench coat who looked like he'd been pulled away from a lukewarm dinner. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. He was in his 50s, with tired eyes and a cynical slump to his shoulders. He had the air of a man who had seen 1,000 domestic disputes that went nowhere. "All right, what's the situation here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping the room, landing on the large group of bikers with a flicker of suspicion. "We got a call about a disturbance." One of the uniformed officers started toward Lena, but Bear subtly shifted his weight, creating a non-confrontational but clear boundary. He addressed Miller directly. "The young lady came in here in distress. Her partner followed her. He was aggressive." Miller sighed. "Okay, a fight. Did he hit you, ma'am?" he asked Lena, his tone weary, routine. Before Lena could answer, Bear spoke again, his voice firm. "She is in fear for her life. He has a history of coercive control. He stole a personal item of significant sentimental value as a means of intimidation. She has a visible injury on her left wrist, consistent with being grabbed forcibly." He recited the facts with the precision of a legal brief. Scribe tore a page from his notebook and held it out to the detective. "Her initial statement," he said simply. Miller took the paper, his eyebrows rising in surprise. On it, in clean, legible script, was a summary of the incident. Lena's name, Richard's name, a description of the locket, and a direct quote of the threat he had made. Miller read the page. He looked from the neat handwriting to the imposing men in their vests, then to Lena, who was huddled in the booth, her eyes wide and terrified. He saw the bruise on her wrist as she lifted her tea mug. Something shifted in his expression. The weariness was replaced by a flicker of focused intensity. This wasn't the usual chaotic, conflicting story. This was organized. This was credible. "All right," he said, his voice losing its dismissive edge. He pulled up a stool. "Ma'am, my name is Detective Miller. I'd like to take a formal statement. Are you willing to file a report against Richard?" Lena looked at the detective, then at the ring of quiet, steady faces around her. They weren't smiling. They weren't offering empty platitudes. They were simply there, a solid, unyielding presence. She took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel ragged and torn. "Yes," she said, her voice small but clear. "I am." The first gear of a great and rusted machine had begun to turn. Detective Miller ran Richard's name through the system back at the precinct. The report came back clean. No priors, no warrants, not even a speeding ticket. On paper, Richard Jennings was a model citizen. He was a partner in a successful regional construction firm, sat on the board of a local youth charity, and had recently been featured in a newspaper article about his company's pro bono work building a new playground. He was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community. Miller had a sinking feeling in his gut. These were the hardest cases, the ones where the abuser's public face was a perfect, impenetrable mask. But Miller had Scribe's notes, and he had the memory of Lena's terror, which felt far more real than any newspaper clipping. He did his due diligence driving to Richard's house to get his side of the story. Richard was the picture of concern. He invited Miller in, offered him coffee, and spoke in grave, sorrowful tones about Lena's emotional instability. He claimed she had been spiraling for months, that he was desperately trying to get her help. He even produced a brochure for a mental health retreat. "I'm just so worried about her," he said, his performance flawless. He explained the locket incident as a misunderstanding, a clumsy attempt to get her to focus during one of her episodes. It was a masterful, believable lie. The silent wardens did not leave town. The funeral they were headed to could wait. A brother's final rites were important, but protecting a life was a more immediate duty. Bear made the call. They checked into a nondescript motel on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint and humming ice machines. They took 3 adjoining rooms. Bear looked Lena in the eye and said, "We're not going anywhere until you're safe." It was a solemn vow. Working with Detective Miller, they helped Lena secure a temporary restraining order. Scribe's meticulously documented statement from the diner became the core of the affidavit. When the uniformed officer served Richard with the papers at his office, he reportedly smiled, signed the acknowledgement, and told the officer he was glad Lena was finally getting the attention she needs. His campaign began immediately. He called mutual acquaintances expressing his heartbreak and worry. He subtly suggested the bikers had somehow kidnapped or brainwashed her. He was charming, convincing, and utterly believable. The town began to fracture. Some who had been in the diner, like Carol the waitress, became fierce advocates for Lena. Carol told the story to anyone who would listen, her voice ringing with conviction. "I saw his eyes," she'd say. "That wasn't worry, that was pure evil." Others, who only knew Richard from charity events or business dealings, shook their heads in sympathy for the poor man, saddled with such a troubled girlfriend. The wardens established a quiet, efficient security protocol at the motel. They never had more than 2 men visible at any one time, sitting in chairs outside the rooms, cleaning parts of their bikes or just watching the road. But they were always there, a rotating, silent watch. They worked with a small, underfunded, local women's advocacy group that Miller had put them in touch with, getting Lena counseling resources and legal advice. One afternoon, Richard's black sedan pulled into the motel parking lot. He got out, holding a bouquet of roses, the very picture of a remorseful lover. He started walking toward Lena's room. 2 of the wardens, a burly man named Gus and a wiry one called Stitch, stood up. They didn't say a word. They simply stood in his path, side by side, their arms crossed. They were an impassable wall of leather and muscle. "I just want to talk to her," Richard said, his charming smile firmly in place. Gus just shook his head slowly. "This is a violation of her privacy. You can't keep me from her," Richard insisted, his voice rising. Stitch pointed a thumb at the "No Trespassing" sign near the motel office. "Private property," he said, his voice flat. "Manager doesn't want you here." Richard's face contorted in a brief flash of fury. He saw the futility of it. He couldn't push past them. He couldn't out-argue them. He was powerless. He threw the roses to the ground, got back in his car, and peeled out of the parking lot, his tires squealing in impotent rage. Meanwhile, Detective Miller, now thoroughly convinced of Richard's guilt, started digging into his past. He didn't look for criminal records, he looked for patterns. He pulled records of Richard's previous addresses and ran the names of women associated with them. He found 2 who had lived with him, both of whom had left town suddenly, severing all ties. It took him a week, but he finally tracked one of them down, a woman named Sarah living 2 states away. When Miller called her and explained the situation, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to talk. Her story was a chilling echo of Lena's. The initial charm, the slow isolation, the financial control, and the final terrifying escape. The public reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom felt both vast and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and floor polish, heavy with the unspoken weight of judgment. Lena sat at the prosecution's table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The case had expanded far beyond a single night in a diner. The charges now included stalking, unlawful imprisonment, and a pattern of coercive control, a charge the young, ambitious prosecutor, Ms. Davies, had fought hard to include. Across the room, Richard sat beside his expensive lawyer, looking calm and distinguished in a tailored suit. He occasionally glanced at the jury, a look of pained sincerity on his face. In the front row of the public gallery sat a formidable line of black leather. Bear, Doc, Scribe, and 3 other wardens were there. They hadn't been asked to come. They had simply appeared, taking their seats with a quiet gravity that seemed to anchor the entire room. They didn't stare at Richard or try to intimidate the jury. They just sat, their presence a silent, unwavering statement of support for the trembling young woman at the front. When Lena was called to the stand, her legs felt like water. She walked past the row of wardens, and Bear met her gaze, giving a single, slow nod. It was all she needed. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked at Ms. Davies. Her testimony was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her voice, shaking at first, grew steadier as she spoke. She recounted the story, not with hysteria, but with a painful, methodical clarity. She described the slow erosion of her freedom, the way he monitored her phone, the humiliation of the weekly allowance, the cold silences that were more frightening than any shout. She described the night he took the locket. "It wasn't about the jewelry," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "It was about taking the last part of me that he didn't already own. It was a message that I was nothing without him." Richard's lawyer was ruthless on cross-examination. "Ms. Miller, isn't it true that you have no family and were financially destitute before you met my client?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Isn't it possible that you are prone to exaggeration, to drama, when you feel you might lose the comfortable lifestyle he provided?" He tried to paint her as a gold digger, an ungrateful and unstable woman lashing out. But Ms. Davies was prepared. Her next witness was Sarah, the ex-girlfriend Detective Miller had found. Sarah, a decade older than Lena, took the stand. Her story was a carbon copy, the same script of love bombing, followed by isolation, financial control, and psychological torment. She even described a similar incident where Richard had confiscated her deceased father's watch. The jury listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to dawning horror. The pattern was undeniable. Next, Detective Miller testified. He detailed his investigation from the initial call to the diner to his interview with the perfectly composed Richard. He described Richard's repeated attempts to contact Lena in violation of the restraining order, including the incident at the motel, which had been witnessed by the wardens and reported by the motel manager. The climax of the trial arrived with a series of devastating blows. First, Ms. Davies presented pawnshop records. The owner, a nervous man in a cheap suit, identified Richard from a photo lineup as the man who had sold a silver locket matching Lena's description just 2 days after she had fled. The locket itself, which Miller had recovered, was entered into evidence. Then came the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. Lena, in a moment of desperate foresight, had figured out how to activate the voice recording software on her laptop during one of Richard's rages. She had hidden it under a stack of magazines. Ms. Davies played the recording for the court. The audio was clear. Richard's voice, no longer smooth and charming, was a venomous snarl. "You are nothing. You have nothing. If you ever leave this house, I will hunt you down and destroy you." The ugly truth of his nature filled the silent courtroom. Richard's composure finally spectacularly shattered. He leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "She's lying. That's fake. That witch is trying to ruin me," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Lena. His own lawyer tried to restrain him, but the damage was done. The jury saw it all. The mask was gone, and the monster was laid bare for the world to see. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a stern face, stood to read the verdict. She cleared her throat and unfolded the paper. "On the charge of stalking, we, the jury, find the defendant." A pause stretched for an eternity. "Guilty." A collective gasp went through the room. "On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of coercive control, we find the defendant guilty." With each word, a layer of tension Lena didn't even know she was carrying dissolved. The sound of the word guilty was the sweetest music she had ever heard. Tears not of fear or sadness, but of profound, bone-deep relief, began to stream down her face. In the front row, Bear slowly reached over and placed a large, warm hand on her shoulder. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Justice, hard-won and desperately sought, had finally been delivered. Richard Jennings was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The story of the respectable contractor and the secret monster he was became a local cautionary tale. His business, built on a foundation of trust he had so thoroughly betrayed, crumbled within months. His name was stripped from the charity board. His perfect public life was reduced to a mugshot and a prison identification number. But the real story, the one that truly mattered, was what happened after the gavel fell. The trial had thrown a harsh spotlight on the town's quiet deficiencies. The local women's advocacy group, which had been operating out of a church basement on a shoestring budget, suddenly found itself at the center of a community-wide conversation. Donations poured in. A local philanthropist, moved by Lena's story, offered them the deed to a small, unused office building downtown. The group finally had a proper headquarters, a visible and accessible safe haven. Carol, the waitress from the Oaken Branch Diner, became an unlikely activist. She and a group of other concerned citizens, the trucker from the counter, the motel manager, a retired teacher, started a volunteer network they called Diner Lights. Their mission was simple: to create a web of informal, safe spaces throughout the town. Local businesses placed a small, discreet sticker of a lit coffee cup in their windows, a signal that anyone in distress could come inside, no questions asked, and be given a safe place to sit, a phone to use, and a connection to help. The ripple effect reached the police department. Detective Miller, haunted by how close Lena had come to being another dismissed, disbelieved victim, championed a new initiative. Inspired by Scribe's methodical note-taking and the crucial detail of the locket, his department developed a new protocol for responding to domestic calls. It was a checklist that trained officers to look beyond the immediate conflict and ask specific questions about subtle signs of control, isolation from family, financial restrictions, the confiscation of personal items. They officially named it the Locket Protocol, and within a year, 2 neighboring counties had adopted it as well. Before the silent wardens finally prepared to ride on, a large, unmarked envelope arrived at the new office of the Women's Advocacy Group. Inside was a cashier's check for a substantial sum, enough to fund their operations for 2 full years. There was no note, no return address, but the director of the group, a weary but tenacious woman named Maria, knew exactly where it came from. The wardens maintained a national fund built from contributions from chapters all over the country for precisely this purpose, to plant seeds of safety in the ground they passed over. Lena, meanwhile, began the slow, quiet work of rebuilding her world. The wardens had helped her find a small, sunny apartment above the town library. The rent was low and the smell of old books drifted up through the floorboards. She got a part-time job there, shelving books, her days filled with a peace she had never known. She enrolled in a community art class, rediscovering a childhood love for sketching. The first thing she drew was her mother's locket, which she now wore every day, not as a reminder of trauma, but as a medal of survival. She started volunteering at the new Women's Center, sitting with other women, sharing her story not as a tragedy, but as a testament. She learned that her voice, once a choked whisper, could be a lifeline for someone else. The legacy of that rainy night was not just one man's downfall, but a community's awakening. It was the quiet, determined rebuilding of a world where people learned to see, to listen, and to believe. Months passed. The green of summer deepened into the gold and crimson of autumn. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Lena sat on a park bench, a sketchbook open on her lap. Her hair had grown longer and she wore it loose, letting it catch the gentle breeze. The constant low-level hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. She was sketching the gnarled branches of an old oak tree, her pencil moving with a newfound confidence. Then she heard it, a low, familiar rumble that vibrated deep in her chest. It grew steadily, a chorus of disciplined engines that was unlike any other sound in the world. She looked up and saw them cresting the hill at the edge of the park, a line of motorcycles, their chrome glinting in the afternoon sun. The silent wardens. They were passing through town just as they had before. They saw her on the bench, and the lead bike signaled the entire procession, pulling over to the side of the road with practiced ease. Bear swung his leg over his bike and walked toward her, the crunch of fallen leaves under his boots. The other wardens stayed with their machines, giving them space. He stopped a few feet away, a small, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth, crinkling the skin around his pale blue eyes. "You look good, kid," he said, his voice the same deep rumble she remembered so well. "I feel good," she replied, and the truth of it resonated in her own ears. She was not the same person who had burst into the diner, soaked and terrified. She was whole. She tilted her sketchbook so he could see. It was filled with drawings, the worn vinyl of the diner booth, a heavy mug of tea, the intricate stoic owl from their vests. And on the last page she had worked on, a detailed rendering of her silver locket, gleaming against a dark background. "I got it back," she said softly. "I bought it back from the pawn shop. Detective Miller helped me." She touched the locket at her throat, a small warm weight against her skin. They didn't stay long. They were men of the road, and the horizon was always calling. As they prepared to leave, the engines rumbling to life one by one, Lena tore a page from her sketchbook and folded it carefully. She walked over to Bear and pressed it into his large, gloved hand. "For you," she said. "For all of you." He nodded, tucking it carefully into the inner pocket of his vest. They shared a final look, one that was filled with a gratitude she could never fully express and an understanding he would never need her to. Then he was on his bike, and with a final nod, he led his brothers back onto the road, their engines a fading promise of protection. Later, miles down the highway, Bear would pull over at a scenic overlook. He would take out the folded paper. It was a charcoal sketch, rendered with surprising skill. It depicted a line of large, faceless men standing shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall. Behind them, the warm, bright light of a diner window spilled out, casting them in silhouette, their shadows long and protective. On the back, in neat, careful script, Lena had written 2 words, "My Guardians." Lena watched from the park bench until the last motorcycle disappeared over the distant ridge. The sound faded, leaving only the rustle of the autumn leaves. She was alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She felt the solid weight of the bench beneath her, the cool metal of the locket against her skin, and the warmth of the setting sun on her face. The world was still a place with monsters hiding behind handsome smiles and respectable facades. But she knew now that it was also a place with guardians. They rode the quiet highways and the forgotten back roads, their purpose not to make noise, but to notice. They were a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is to simply pay attention, and that courage, even a sliver of it, is enough to light a beacon that they can see from a long, long way off.